So we're talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days in October 1962. And our first subtopic is October 14, 15, 1962, setting up the crisis. Okay? Now, the thing to remember about the Cuban Missile Crisis is it involved the two most powerful countries and the two most powerful leaders in the world. President Kennedy of the United States and Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union. We've talked about him before, but he'll be a big-time player in this lecture and this particular crisis. So you've got the two most powerful countries in the world and the two most powerful leaders in the world in conflict here. President Kennedy of the United States and Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union. And I don't really want you to write this down yet, but I want you to understand it, is that these guys are going to be under tremendous pressure by both of their militaries during this particular time. And what do militaries like to do lots of times? They like to be aggressive, and being aggressive in this situation on the part of either world leader could lead us to a nuclear holocaust. So they're really under pressure, both sides. So the thing that we call the Cuban Missile Crisis actually begins on Sunday, October 14, 1962. Begins on Sunday, October 14, 1962. And on that date, very early in the morning, an Air Force major by the name of Richard Heiser left Edwards Air Force Base in California in his U-2 spy plane. Early in the morning on Sunday, October 14, 1962, Air Force Major Richard Heiser left Edwards Air Force Base in California in his U-2 spy plane. Now, where do you think he was headed? No? Cuba. Well, at 7:31 a.m., at 7:31 a.m., Heiser crossed the coastline of Cuba and he photographed the island. It took him 12 minutes to fly over and photograph. So at 7:31 a.m., he crosses the coastline of Cuba, basically going into enemy airspace, and he photographs the island of Cuba. It takes him 12 minutes to make his run. So he leaves Edwards Air Force Base in the morning. He reaches the shoreline of Cuba at 7:31 a.m. It takes him 12 minutes to scope the island and take the photographs, reconnaissance photographs. He takes the photographs, he lands in southern Florida, and he turns his film over to members of the CIA. Okay, so he makes this run early in the morning on October 14th. He reaches the Cuban coastline at 7:31 a.m. Takes him 12 minutes to photograph the island. He U-turns, lands in Florida, and turns his film over to the CIA. Well, the CIA then sent those photographs to Washington, D.C., where they were developed on Monday, October 15th. So the film is sent to Washington, D.C., and it is developed on Monday, October 15th. And these photographs that were developed on Monday, October 15th, produced some pretty shocking results for the United States. Several men studied those photographs, including a guy by the name of Michael Davis. Several men studied the photographs that were taken that morning by Air Force Major Heiser. And Michael Davis reported that the photographs that were taken showed long circular objects that measured between 65 feet and 100 feet in length. So Michael Davis was one of many men who studied the photographs, but it was Michael Davis that reported to the CIA that these photographs clearly showed long circular objects that measured between 65 feet and 100 feet in length. Well, another one of the men who studied those photographs and those long circular objects that measured between 65 and 100 feet was Dino Brugoloni. Dino, what? Yeah, D-I-N-O. Does it not have it on it? No, it's O, sorry. Dino Brugoloni. Now, Brugoloni was an expert in ballistic missiles, the identification of ballistic missiles. And when Ruganoni looked at those photos, he determined that these were Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles. Ruganoni determined that these objects that were first identified by Davis were Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles. Now, once you determine what type of missile it was, what might be your next question? Well, or how far could they go? Because where are they at? They're on the ground in Cuba. Okay? Well, Ruganoni determined that the range of these Soviet SS-4 missiles were up to 2,000 miles. So they would be able to strike any place in the United States from Cuba within 2,000 miles, which would mean every major city except Seattle. Seattle would be the only major city that those missiles could not reach in the United States. So he determined the range of these missiles up to 2,000 miles, making every city in the nation vulnerable with the exception of Seattle. Well, the next person to study him was a guy by the name of Art Lundell. Art Lundell. And he was actually the director of the CIA who interpreted these photographs. Okay? He was the bigwig. He was the main guy. And after listening to these other guys, he takes a look. And he's determining what he's seen. And he looked at both Davis and Ruganoni and said, quote, "This is trouble. This is real trouble." Because they had Soviet SS-4 missiles with a range of 2,000 miles on the ground in Cuba. Not good. That's what happened the 14th and the 15th of October. Yep. Yeah, we'll talk all about that. That's quite a story. Don't tell anybody yet. Okay, so we'll move to Tuesday, October 16th. No, it's okay. So y'all understand what happened the 14th and 15th. We took the photos, we developed them, we decided we got trouble in Cuba. We got Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles on the ground in Cuba. Yep.
Were they expecting to find something since they went, like, humans go to the top, like...
They're always expecting something, but they did not expect the multitude of
So it was
this.
like normal for him to go take pictures?
Oh yeah, remember that Gary Powers got shot down over Russia? We're always checking on each other, yeah. Well, Tuesday, October 16th is really the official beginning of what we know as 13 days in October. It's the first day of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The other 2 days just set up the crisis, okay? And here's what happened on October 16th. At 9 o'clock in the morning that day, President Kennedy called his brother Bobby and asked him to come to the White House. So at 9 a.m. on Tuesday, October 16th, 1962, President Kennedy called his brother Bobby and asked him to come to the White House. Why did he have Bobby come to the White House?
He was trustworthy and he also...
Right. President Kennedy had received information about these missiles. So when Bobby arrived, the president filled his brother in with the early information he had received. And as Hannah said, he's the Attorney General, which has nothing to do probably with this. But again, he was his brother who he trusted and wanted him there. So Bobby arrives, and the president fills him in on the early information he had on the photographs. He also told Bobby that the CIA would be given an official briefing that morning. In other words, the CIA was going to come in later that morning and give an official briefing on the situation in Cuba. And that happened at 11:45 a.m. is when the CIA came in and briefed him. But John Kennedy called his brother and got him there to prep him up a little bit before the CIA came in at 11:45. Now, the man that gave the formal presentation to President Kennedy and members of his cabinet from the CIA was a guy by the name of Marshall Carter. Marshall Carter. He's the guy that gave the official briefing from the CIA to President Kennedy and several members of his cabinet, including Bobby. So at 11:45 a.m., Marshall Carter of the CIA is the one that gave the formal presentation to President Kennedy and several members of the Kennedy cabinet. Now, what Carter basically told the president was there not only were missiles on the ground in Cuba, but there were missile launching pads being constructed on the grounds in Cuba. Which meant at the time, it's an important term you understand, is that these missiles at this time are non-operational. They're not able to be launched. And our concern is going to be that they never become operational. Okay? So what the CIA reports to the President and his cabinet is there are missiles on the ground and missile launching pads that would launch the missiles, or have the ability to launch the missiles, under construction. So we are concerned at this point that the United States is in great danger, especially if those missiles become operational, which means they have the ability to be fired, which they do not at the time. Okay? Well, Kennedy is going to need some help to explore options on what to do about this problem in Cuba, so he organizes a committee to be involved in these decisions. So to seek help to explore options on what to do about the problem in Cuba, President Kennedy is going to organize a committee. And these are the three types of people that are going to be on that committee. Okay, the President's going to organize a committee to explore options on what to do with the problem in Cuba, and these are the type of people that are going to be on the committee. What type of people are going to be on the committee? Who would you have on the committee? What? Well, yeah, but specifically, what type of people? You're going to have military leaders, okay? You're going to have selected leaders of the United States military. You're not going to have all, but selected members of your cabinet, okay? So he's going to have selected members of the military that are leaders. He's going to have selected members of his cabinet. But who else might you bring in, other than cabinet members and military? Who might you bring in? What's that? Go ahead, what? Maybe, no, probably not, because you're going to have to ask them for action if things get crazy here. So who might else you bring in? You might bring in some people that might have some expertise. What's that? Not exiles. But you might have people that served in other presidents' cabinet that have expertise in dealing with the Russians, for example. So you'd bring in other influential government leaders that might be able to shed some light on the subject. Now, Taylor makes a good point by she mentions Congress, but probably not those people, because they're going to have to go to those people for action.
Well, that's why I thought maybe he wanted them in the cabinet because they were.
Well, it's kind of like being on the school board. You don't want a school board to be a member of a committee, like if you're going to have a committee on attendance policy, because they have to make decisions on it. So you can keep up. Now, here's the name of this committee. It's the only time you'll have to write down the full name, because I got a shortcut. But the committee would officially be called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. That is the official name of the committee. The Executive Committee of the National Security Council. It would be better known in U.S. history as XCOM. Yep. So the committee would be called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. The committee would become better known in American history as XCOM. So XCOM is the committee that Kennedy used to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Officially called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. Now, let's tell you who was on the let's see who was on the committee. Okay? And if you look up at the board up here, we've got a lot of them. So you also got pictures. Who might you have on your XCOM committee there, Buck? Well, let's not. Come on, let's start. Yeah, you're ticking them. How about, would you want your Secretary of State on there? Surely would. Dean Rusk. So Secretary of State, Dean Rusk. And we've talked about quite a few of these people. Dean Rusk, your Secretary of State. I think, what did you say, Curtis Lemay? Okay, we'll get to that later. How about your Secretary of Defense? Would you want that person on there? Who would that be? Remember? Nothing.
What were you going to say? Somebody said something about that.
Robert McNamara.
His name started with T, possibly?
Nothing. So you want your Secretary of Defense on there, Robert McNamara. Now this was a little odd to me, but I was surprised he had this person on there, but I think it had to do with trust. He had a Secretary of the Treasury there, C. Douglas Dillon, also. C. Douglas Dillon. So if you look up at the old board here, okay, you can see some of these people. We're going to talk about more. But you've got Rusk, C. Douglas Dillon, Robert McNamara. Okay? Other members he had. He had the Vice President, Lyndon Johnson. Although he didn't consult with him much, he was on the committee. Vice President Lyndon Johnson. Obviously had his brother, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, on the committee. We talked about this person before. You may not remember his name, but the National Security Advisor at the time was a fellow by the name of McGeorge Bundy. McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor. Kennedy's National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy, was on the ExComm committee. You think you'd have the director of the CIA? Certainly would. And remember that became John McCone. John McCone, because Kennedy fired Allen Dulles after the Bay of Pigs disaster. So John McCone will be your CIA director. Now, let's talk about somebody that would have some expertise. Who was a very good politician but just didn't have any luck winning any elections for the Democratic Party? Good guy. Adlai Stevenson. And at the time, and he becomes an incredibly important player in this crisis, he is the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And he's on the committee. Adlai Stevenson, U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. He is a crucial member of this. Great story, and you'll learn more about that later. So U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson. Well, we're going to have somebody prepare the president probably for a lot of speeches, right, during this crisis. So he's got his speechwriter, Theodore Sorensen. Theodore Sorensen. All these people are on the board if you ever want to take a look. Theodore Sorensen. Another person that he brings on, and we talked about him briefly, this guy was the former Secretary of State under President Truman, a guy by the name of Dean Acheson. He brought him in because he had experience working with Russia during the time he was with Truman. And Acheson is like H-S-O-N. Dean Acheson. He was the former Secretary of State under President Truman, and Kennedy brought him in as well. Another very important name, and we mentioned him, I think we talked about at a glance, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff was General Maxwell Taylor. This fellow right here, General Maxwell Taylor. He was the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. The Army was in control of the military at that time. They had the Joint Chief of Staff, and General Maxwell Taylor will be the highest ranking military officer other than the President. Okay? So, chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, General Maxwell Taylor, was on the, and we talked about him in one of our at-a-glances. Now, Buck, who else might be on there? Curtis Lemay. He was a general, and he was the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. He was the highest ranking officer in the United States Air Force, Curtis Lemay. And here's a picture of Curtis Lemay right here. I just got this over Christmas vacation. Curtis Lemay. He'll have a big role in this. So Curtis Lemay. Also, another general involved was General Walter Sweeney. And he had an interesting title. The United States has a tactical air command. Those that are specialized in tactical air strikes. And he was the commander of the United States Tactical Air Command. He led those particular strikes when ordered to by his superiors. Commander of the U.S. Tactical Air Command, Walter Sweeney. He's up here somewhere too, if I can find him. Walter Sweeney. Okay? He is the commander of the U.S. Tactical Air Command. Good question. Would be in the Air Force, yes. Who else might you? You got the Army involved with Taylor. You got the Air Force involved with Lemay and Sweeney. Who else might you want involved in this thing? It's the Navy. And the chief naval operator was Admiral George W. Anderson Jr. And here is George Anderson Jr. right here. He was the commander of the Navy. He was the chief of naval operations. Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral George W. Anderson, Jr. And the final member, and this is pretty good, and you'll see it really well in the movie, the final member that President Kennedy wanted on XCOM was his appointment secretary, Kenneth O'Donnell. Very important player in this. Just a little appointment secretary, but again, like his brother Robert, someone that Kennedy trusted beyond belief. Kenneth O'Donnell. And he was simply Kennedy's appointment secretary. So you got Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Secretary of the Treasury C. Douglas Dillon, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, CIA Director John McComb, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Adlai Stevenson, Presidential Speechwriter and Advisor Theodore Sorensen, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Maxwell Taylor, Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force General Curtis Lemay, Commander of the U.S. Tactical Air Command General Walter Sweeney, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral George W. Anderson, Jr., former Secretary of State under President Truman Dean Acheson, and Kennedy's appointment secretary, Kenneth O'Donnell. Everyone will have a key. You need to know who they are. You will know them well when we're done. Well, so these guys get together later in the day and they have a very lengthy discussion to come up with an option of what they're going to do in Cuba. Okay? What do you think the most talked about option was? Use of military force. Okay? Use of military force. What did that mean? It meant that the United States would launch airstrikes upon the island of Cuba, followed by what? Invasion. That was the first option that came up. The use of military force. The United States would launch airstrikes upon the island of Cuba, followed by invasion.